Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with Chapter 2, and we're going to start talking about theories of development. So, some of the objectives that we will be going through with this chapter is, what exactly child development theories will help us with and tell us. What are the different hypotheses as well as modern applications to the theories? We'll look at neuropsychology as well as behavioral genomics. And then, of course, we're going to talk about cultural influences of child development. Now, there's two important functions that we have to look at in terms of theories of development, and that is how we are organized, the knowledge that we have, as well as how we go about making predictions on the information that's been provided to us. So through this, it's a systematic way of organizing these ideas that comes from observations. And basically, what happens is we'll develop models that's going to help us to predict how children might behave in the future. That is what the developmental theory is all about. So a lot of theories, they're usually going to be able to um, attempt to prove, but never really prove beyond a shadow of a doubt the scientific process that would help us to gather evidence in support or, might even oppose different ideas. So, how do developmental theories differ? One thing we look at are qualitative versus quantitative theories. Now, qualitative theories, you can think of these as stage type theories, and that's because each stage of life is going to be different from one, and it comes before and then after. Uh, you can see it as the difference between two types of changes that might occur, like within our memories. Children, they may remember more, which is expected as they get older. That would be considered a quantitative type of change. However, it might suddenly increase their memory capacity when they develop encoding or other techniques, which is called qualitative changes. Why does development happen in the first place? Well, developmental changes, they're driven by our biological process, as we talked about. When we're born, we initially have some instinctual activities, but then it's influenced by those environmental events that's going to affect each of us. And because of this interaction, development, it may makes a way for us to express and be able to know what our experiences are about. So, an important way developmental theories would be different from one another is kind of the internal and external influences on development. Now, let's look at some specific theories. Of course, we've heard of Sigmund Freud, and if you haven't heard of Sigmund Freud, as I mentioned in other courses, I call him art, the artist of psychology. In that he looks at the psyche, which is the mind, and analyze and interpret the different parts of the mind individually to be able to see how they would relate to one another. So, because this I consider the first theory of stage development, there's always been controversy on how to research it, and that's why I consider it an art. But in this theory, he kind of utilizes biological urges and talks about how each person may move through a series of stages that's going to help to shape their personality in the future. So, although the psychoanalytic theory has been controversial as far as the science is concerned, many of its concepts are really ingrained and they've been made a part of our assumptions on how the mind works. Also, Freud, he has been recognized as one of the most influential people of the 20th century. He's in that top 100. So right now, what I'm going to do is just give you a video, like the video play, in which it's going to talk about some differences between Freud as well as Erikson's, who was once a student of his and then kind of branched away because he had a different theory in mind. But talk about some of the differences within the stage developments.
Mary has a 3-month-old daughter. Mary follows her child, who follows a strict schedule for being the child Mary is affectionate and all her child's affectionate Sigmund Freud psychosexual theory and Erik psychosocial are two important psychoanalytic theories of human development that combine to explain the developmental effects of the Most likely, we'll examine what these two theories have in common and how they differ. Erikson's theory follows Freud's, and it was based on many Freud's ideas. Because of this, the chief of the both girls they also both separate developmental stages of a person's life and realize similar age division for developmental stages. However, also the differences that exist between the age of a stage and the developmental issues that are included in the first stage. What drives a person's development? Freud's psychosexual theory emphasizes the importance of faith and feeling and biological person. But Erikson's psychosocial theory is based upon social and environmental factors. Erikson outputs Kearns-Cooper into Untitled, where Freud found therapy as a Now it's time to look at Freud-focused social therapy and Erikson-focused social therapy. First involved in the first year of life. Freud called this the oral stage of development because he believed that oral stimulation was the primary means for development. Erikson thought this stage of development trauma was first and best treatment. Both believed that child acts must be treatment before development. Next, let's discuss the first two theories. Freud called this the oral stage of development, but Erikson called it the primary versus both believed that the indicated is learned at this stage of development, and that cruelty is an important focus of independence. Fundamentalism ages 3 through 6 is a function of performance and the initial emotional response. Freud in the last stage, Ch02, identifies with the same sense of life and develops self-esteem. Erikson thought that this was a stage where a child gains control over their environment. This is the point where we start to see more differences in each of the The next developmental stage occurs after Freud calls this stage of development empathy is the second intermediary stage of development. Freud saw
And I have to apologize, we got kind of cut off. It's probably has a part 2, but you kind of get an idea. And we're going to talk more about those stages later on, so I'm not going to try to start up another video. We'll just move on from that. So not only did Freud come up with the psychosexual stages of development, he also discussed that we have basically 3 parts that goes toward our personality, that being the id, the ego, and the superego. So more or less, according to Freud, he basically said that we are all born with an id. And now we talked about the id in the sense as when we talked about instincts. Freud felt that our basic instinctual drives is what is found within the id. So that means babies, they really don't have any way to control these drives. They just want what they want when they want it. Just like when we talked about the automatic sucking because the baby's hungry. So a baby's not going to automatically be polite and wait for mommy to finish what she's doing when they're hungry. They're going to just start crying because that's, the food is necessary. It's a survival, and they feel the need for it to be able to be satisfied. And that's to hopefully also satisfy that basic drive. So the id, what it does is operates on what we call the pleasure principle, or what Freud named the pleasure principle. And that's because we're looking for immediate gratification for our urges. Now, as a child grows older, they'll start to become more aware about reality in the world around them. And then what happens is their abilities to think and abilities to control their emotions come into play. This ability to be able to negotiate between their basic drives as well as the real world is now the job of the ego. Okay, so the ego is going to start developing, and what happens is a child, they'll become more inspired to be able to fulfill their basic drives, but they're also able to interact with the world around them in order to get their needs met. So although a child might be hungry, he or she can now see that, she has to wait until mommy or daddy is finished with what their task is, and then politely ask, may I have something to eat? Or can I have a cookie, as the text may say? In working with the wants and desires that we have, that's between our basic drives and the world around us, this is what Freud named the reality principle. Finally, around the ages of 5 to 7, this is when a child is going to start looking at morality, okay? And those principles, they're more drive motivated functioning of the id. So you think of the superego, which is what's terms of morality. That's the referee between the id and the ego. The ego is going to help to kind of curtail the id's basic instinct to want to be impulsive and grab at it, whereas the morality principle is going to be showing why you should do things in a particular way. Okay, Freud felt that children, they don't have any real internal sense of guilt, which would help to guide us until they start to develop that superego. So a younger child might simply grab a cookie when they're hungry without asking, whereas an older child will be able to have self-control and resist temptation simply because they know taking the cookie is wrong. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the psychoanalytic theory. You've already heard about the first 3 stages in the video. And so now I'm going to just continue a little bit more about some of the other stages. Let's talk a little bit about first the phallic stage. And this again is going to be around 3 to 6 years old. And it's during this time when sexual energy will become more focused, as particularly with the genitals. And one of the biggest mistakes I find parents make as children are growing up is that when they notice that their child is becoming curious about their bodies, such as grabbing their genitals, parents often make that taboo and go, no, you can't do that. Well, it's important for children to be able to develop healthy, to know who they are as an individual and a person. And part of that is learning about their genitals. So boys and girls, they're going to develop, uh, in terms of how they see and what they realize in terms of the genitals. What happens is they usually develop what they call the family romance. Now, this is where boys will start thinking about their mother more than a mom, but someone that they might marry when they grow up. It's like my son, he told me that his wife often reminds him of me, which I say I don't see it, but nonetheless, that was a gauge for him. Same holds true for when we speak about girls. They imagine, according to Freud, marrying their father. So to be able to move on into this psychosexual stage, children have to learn how to give up those desires and start to identify with the parent of the same sex. If they are still heavily relying on the opposite, Freud felt that that would be a conflict and that can inhibit development of the child. So now the latency stage, this is between 6 and 12 years of age, and latent means inactive. So Freud felt that during this time, the sex drive, it goes down under, it's suppressed. Children don't think about it anymore. They move away from their fantasies within the phallic period, and then they realize that they really have to start looking at becoming a grown-up themselves. And so this sex drive, it kind of provides an energy to allow for that learning to take place, similar to when the child was, doing the exploration of touching. Same now holds true mentally, okay? But it's not overly expressed. So children pretty much is going to transfer, their interest of their parents from that family romance, and it moves now into wanting to be more interactive with their peers, people of their age. They're going to see cross-sex friendships. Sometimes it's relinquished as boys and girls learn the meaning of what they call cooties, as well as they'll profess disgust for one another during this particular age. Think about when you were around 6 or 12 years old. Usually the adage was, if a boy punched you in the arm, that meant he really liked you. I didn't think so because that hurt, but you get the picture. Now, the separation of the sexes, they'll start to begin to change around 12 years old, which is pubescence. And this is when adolescence starts to take an effect, because now our bodies are changing during this time. The genital area is becoming different. And at this point, the sexual energy is going to be now focused more on that genital area. So now peers are really taking on a different role, because now boys will start wanting to like girls because there's this sexual charge that's now between them. Bottom line is, with genital 12 and older, this is when the adult sexuality kicks in which we become attracted to the opposite sex or the same sex. It's the sexual attraction that's what's specific. So now I'm going to play this video. It's going to be talking about the psychosocial stages of development. We already heard a little bit about trust versus mistrust, as well as autonomy versus shame and doubt. But Erikson had came up with 8 stages that range from birth to old age. And I need to make a comment here. There really was a 9th stage that the textbooks really don't talk much about. Specifically, it's called wisdom versus transcendence. And one thing which you'll notice with the psychosocial stages, those 8 stages shows a positive versus a negative, so to speak. Well, the 9th stage was all positive. And doing the readings, one of the things I just discovered is he wasn't able to finish it because he completed it by transcending into the afterlife. His wife attempted to complete the work, Anna Erikson, but unfortunately she passed on before completing it as well. But I'm going to go ahead and play this video so that you can kind of get an understanding of the 8 stages that's from birth to elder.
Successful completion of earlier stages. Failure to complete each stage may lead to future conflicts. In their quest to fit in, adolescents say sorry to while many adults develop loving companionship and pursue them, some develop rejection and identity, which can lead to isolation. Once one discovers the
All right. So that's a question for you to think about. How might you use Erikson stages in terms of working with kids? Okay, so once again, let's take a look at comparing Freud's and Erikson stages, okay? When we're talking about the oral stages, Freud felt that this was the pleasure principle, and basically the focus here was being able to take in, whereas Erikson felt that trust versus mistrust is meaning the development of trust with caregivers, parents, as well as ability to be able to cope or not cope with a sense of helplessness or hopelessness. The anal stage here, Freud felt that the focus would be on the anal region, which is also responsible for control of one's body and its products. You might have heard of the phrase anal retentive, in that people who are anal retentive, they're usually really saying tight is one way of making you see the idea, but they're really wanting perfection, being meticulous, needing the cleanliness. So that might become a conflict within that stage, as according to Freud. Whereas autonomy versus shame and doubt, here Erikson felt that the toddler would be looking more to become independent, as well as learning how to gain more self-control because of being not as confident as they wanted to be. Phallic stage here is looking at the family romance, as mentioned before, as well as the exploration of genitalia. And in terms of initiative versus guilt for Erikson, here this is where a child would want to start showing some excitement about different activities, or they might become over controlled or feel bad about things that they're doing. When we talk about the phallic stage, here Freud is speaking more about, again, that development within, oh, I think I said phallic, sorry, let me move on. Latency is what I should be talking about. And that's actually talking about that sexual energy, how it's kind of suppressed momentarily. Uh, children, they are becoming curious about their peers, uh, and they're more into wanting to learn things rather than having any type of sexual urges. Uh, as far as Erikson's concerned, he speaks about industry versus inferiority. Learning is also happening here, but it's in regards to how we would fit in with society. And if we don't have that feeling, if we're not successful within this, then we may feel inadequate. Okay. Also within that would be the identity versus role confusion, in which it's talking about the integration of our experiences or our identity. Um, do we know who we are as a person? Or if we don't, that role confusion, what is it that I'm supposed to be doing? Okay. This can also go in line with Freud's genital stage, in that here, this is where the sexual energy is going to reach that adult maturity level, where now you're going to want to be with someone who sexually entices you. Okay. Uh, as far as for Freud, the genital stage is pretty much it. It stops there, and it's like if you're successful within those 5 stages, then adulthood should be okay for you. Whereas Erikson, of course, continues on, and he goes through different stages, um, and talks about the different stages, which you just heard the 8 stages, so I'm not going to repeat those again for you, but you now kind of get a pretty good understanding. So this is going to end today's lecture. We'll stop here in talking about Erikson and talking about Freud. And when we get back, we'll continue on chapter 2. Thanks for listening.